Without thinking, if you could have anything in the world right now, what would it be?
A chocolate bar?
Chocolate.
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 Chocolate!
Chocolate.
Chocolate.
Chocolate. Chocolate.
Chocolate.
It's chocolatey.
It's chocolate to chocolate.
Chocolate?
White chocolate!
Hello, scholars. So today we're going to be looking at SCO 2.1. Now you might be wondering why, if we're talking about interdependence and globalization, I started this lesson with a huge thing about chocolate. What we're going to do as we unpack the concept of interdependence and globalization is we're going to look at it from a point of commodities, because commodities provide a really interesting entry point for us to unpack concepts of interdependence, globalization, and theoretically exploitation. So we already had some interesting discussions about capitalism and colonialism. So you guys already have a means to approach what makes globalization so pernicious. And we're gonna maybe also define pernicious after. Hey, why don't we throw some other 10-cent words in there? What about deleterious? We're gonna go all the way in today. So at its simplest, interdependence refers to two or more countries and their impact on one another. Okay, that makes sense. How does that connect to globalization? Globalization is the economic, social, and political interaction and integration of people in different areas of the world. So, I'm still not clear. And how does this relate to chocolate? What's this lady doing? The globalization can be better understood as spread of products and technology and information across national borders. So we live in when we say we live in a globalized world, we have all these structures of trade. And what do we trade? We trade commodities. So this is why we are jumping in and looking at commodities, because we need commodities for trade. But now in our globalized world and our increased technological systems, commodities aren't always like physical things. They can be things like Bitcoin that doesn't actually like tangibly exist. So those things are hard to understand. What we're going to look at for commodities is we are going to look at agricultural commodities, because those have really interesting systems set up, and we have to rely on other countries for commodities, agricultural commodities specifically, in a way that is really, really easy to understand. And I am going to explain it to you using chocolate as an example. So let's dive in and look at what does chocolate look like in its raw state, where the heck does it come from, and why that's important. So the chocolate that you're familiar with usually comes what? In a chip or a chunk or a bar. That chocolate we know to be one thing. It also has other things added to it, like sugar and flavoring. When we think of chocolate, like I'm sure when you watched the reel at the beginning, you thought of finished chocolate. This is an example of one of the plants. Also, this is an example of one of the plants. Do you want to see what they look like inside? Very, very different from what we would normally think of when we think of chocolate. So here's the beans that are inside that white pulp. The pulp is also edible, by the way. You can eat the pulp. It's like a fruit. But where the heck does that grow? This is a really interesting graphic representation of what we know as the cocoa belt. So chocolate, which we all have in absolute abundance here, only grows in this very narrow region, 20 degrees south or north of the equator. So for you to have your chocolate as you know it, it has to start somewhere. So we rely upon, in an interdependent network of a globalized world, for those raw commodities to be shipped elsewhere, to be grown somewhere and then shipped elsewhere to be processed. So we have to think about these commodities too in terms of something called the supply chain. This is the definition of supply chain. It's the sequence of processes involved in the distribution of a commodity. So a lot of hands become involved in our interrelated circle of how we get a raw commodity to be a finished product and then done. We're all going to have a commodity that we're going to take over the course of this class, an agricultural commodity, and we're all going to become experts in our commodity. As we proceed through our course, you're going to be building upon previous knowledge, and you're going to stick with your commodity. This might sound complicated right now, but it's not. Our very first assignment is going to be producing a graphic representation of just who profits in a supply chain, so we can all have a really interesting visualization of who is profiting in a globalized world, and maybe some of the forces of exploitation that are happening. I think it's going to be good. Now, I presented my breakdown as a very wacky, old-fashioned game show style. So I'm going to show you what it looks like. This is just for fun, for your watching pleasure.
Welcome back, everyone. Once again, it's time for everyone's favorite game show, What's in a Bar? Let's slip into something a little more comfortable and get down to business. Who profits in the supply chain? Here's how we play the game. Now, on a scale of 0 to 100%, who makes what? If we put a line here, who do you think is profiting the most? That's right, it's sales at 44%. Then if we add another line right over here at the 79% mark, 35% gets awarded to manufacturers, leaving only 21% for everyone else. But if we add another line, that 7% remaining, that is what goes to farmers. Thanks for playing, farmers. We'd love to give you more, but we just can't bother. But you'll get some parting gifts today: child labor and neo-colonial exploitation. What's in a bar?
So, now that you have seen my game show breakdown of the chocolate bar and who gets what in the supply chain, it really does show you who's all involved in those processes and then who is profiting the most. When you go to look at your commodity, you're going to find really similar interesting things. I want you to attach your sources. I don't want you to way overthink this. I just want to get some graphic representations. In different places, you're going to find some different numbers. That's because we have, in a globalized world, we have some things being put out in euros. We have some things being put out in USD, billions of dollars. We have all these kind of things. You're going to attach your source. We're going to know what you're graphically representing. And remember, this is our entry point. We're becoming familiar with these commodities, but we're going to learn so much over the course of this class and all the different levels. But what we see with my chocolate one, the most important people for us to have chocolate are making the very least. So what does that say about our globalized economy and how it's arranged and who's benefiting? So I want you to always keep that top of mind as we examine globalization and free trade. And in the coming weeks, we're going to have some talks about fair trade and different ways to organize economies. Maybe people aren't as disadvantaged. So when we looked at that cocoa belt and we examined where that grows, we know that we can't have chocolate unless it's grown in a very minute area, which is also why we're looking at agricultural commodities, because you're going to discover that a lot of your agricultural commodities can only grow in very specific places. And the other thing that I want you to begin thinking about is how we use terms to define places and how we consider them in our chain when we're looking at our supply chain and when we're looking at interdependence, because it's not necessarily super equal. It's not just as simple as, when I give you that initial definition, it's not as simple as we just rely on one another and it's really equal. We know that sometimes some people are disadvantaged and some people are advantaged, and that comes from, as we previously talked about, historical colonial roots, and then the development of modern day capitalism utilizing those historical roots. And so we have terms too, like neocolonialism, and the other part that we're going to come back to later that we don't have time for today is we're going to talk a little more about trade liberalization. and what that means, but that is, we want to start narrow it in. So we're not doing that today. But I want you to, when you hear those terms, just turn those over. So I'm going to show you a map. What do you think? Why do you think this map is colored this way? We've already had a little bit of talk about where things grow. We've already had a little bit of ideas, but why do you think this map is colored this way? Well, this map is designed to show us the idea of the global south and the global north. Now, have any of you ever heard that term before? Maybe you have, maybe you haven't. It's actually a really common term. We tend to use terms like industrialized nations, developing nations, developed nations, and all these kind of words. You also might hear me use terms like West. When I say West, I'm referring to Western industrialized democracies. So that's also why if you look at our global south map, you're going to see that Australia, which is in the southern hemisphere, is obviously, you know, how can we call that north? But we're not referring to geographical terms. We're referring to Western industrialized democracies. They're advantaged and they're not value neutral. Like the fact that some countries are industrialized by the sheer fact that they had opportunities and they stole resources from places earlier. Resources, remember, commodities, we can connect those ideas. I would like you to use the term global south instead of terms like third world. It almost sounds like countries are disadvantaged because they just didn't like try to industrialize hard enough. But it also negates, when we're looking at agricultural products, it also negates the fact that like we now have infrastructures and systems in place to make sure places cannot industrialize in the same way because we're relying on them so much for agricultural communities and we purposefully put them into states of poverty. So we're going to build on that a lot more later, but I just want you to know as you start to search for your commodities, you're going to come across those words, and I don't want you to think those are the normal ways that we discuss stuff. We have to have a political understanding at all times. So one more way we can look at the idea of interdependence and globalization and who gets to benefit and have what is if we look at these two separate graphs. So when I told you about the cocoa belt and where chocolate grows, I'm going to show you now a graph that talks about just how much cocoa is produced in certain regions. So if we look at West Africa in specifics, we know that most of our cocoa comes from the Ivory Coast and from Ghana, which are in the West African part of that cocoa belt. But then when we look at who gets to consume most of the chocolate, look at who the top consumers of chocolate are. But what's the other big thing they have in common? It's global north. Global north is who gets to consume most of the chocolate that's produced. So how does that make sense for our interdependence? How does that make sense in context of our theories of exploitation? It provides a pretty interesting picture. Hey, speaking of pictures, let's get down to what we're going to do for our project. Let us go. We're going to have a very interesting time.
The land of chocolate. Wow, chocolate. Half price. La 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 la.
Mr. Simpson.
La 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 la.
Mr. Simpson.
Huh? Oh, I'm sorry. We were talking about chocolate?
That was 10 minutes ago.